Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. We've got some more recaps and predictions for round 2 of the NBA playoffs as they continue through the weekend. We also have the draft lottery results to discuss as well. Before we do get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we had, a pretty wild weekend of NBA hoops. A lot of things happened, right? We had some teams that we thought were done. Maybe they're not done.
Yeah,
We had teams that we thought were on their way to glory, but they might fall flat on their face.
100%.
So, let's get into that. Um, so first off, we'll kick it off with, we're recording this not super long after Nuggets Timberwolves game 4, right? Obviously, we had game 3 and game 4. Game 3, they completely just wiped Minnesota off the floor. Wasn't really close, pretty much wire to wire Denver, blowout win, right? Great response from the defending champs. They've made some big adjustments in these last couple of games where it's like, now Aaron Gordon gets to flash some of his ball handling, bringing it up the floor, right? So that way Jamal Murray's not bringing it up 94 feet against pressure, right? You can see like Jokic, right, kind of putting some puzzle pieces together and, figuring out how to score against some of these guys that he was really struggling to score against the first couple of games, right? Michael Porter Jr. slows down, but guess what? Guys like Justin Holiday, Christian Brown, all of a sudden, even Reggie Jackson has a few big moments. Game 3, yeah, like that one was pretty bad. From Minnesota on both ends of the floor. Game 4, I think, was the one that was going to be very interesting, obviously, because that's a swing game, right? Which we talked about the idea of the swing games last year, right? Because we had a couple of series in the playoffs last year where, like I know it was like Lakers Warriors game 4, right? Like that's a swing game because Lakers were up 2-1. They lose, it's 2-2. If they win, they go up 3-1. Well, that's what was going on here, right? If Minnesota had won this game, they'd be up 3-1. The series probably over. I think we forget that Denver did come back from a couple of 3-1 deficits, I believe, in the bubble. But this is also a different Minnesota team. But then obviously, if Denver wins 2-2 back to Denver, that's exactly what happened. This one was a little bit different because, Minnesota early in the game had an advantage, and then Denver once again kind of pulled away, really behind their very high level shot making, which hadn't really been there for most of the playoffs. The adjustments, right, continued, right? Where, like I said, they had guys bringing up, like Jokic and Gordon bringing up the ball because you don't really want to ball pressure with Towns and Gobert because they're going to pick up fouls. They did that a few times in this game. Also, the defense was turned up, from the Denver perspective as well, right? Like even Jokic had some stretches, um, especially in game 3, right, where he was getting into some areas and getting some stops, getting some steals and deflections and blocks. Gordon was great as well. Christian Brown coming in guarding Edwards and like, not always just conceding buckets, but sometimes just sending them to the line, making it a little bit more difficult. Obviously, game 4, Edwards was, tremendous. He had 43 or whatever, but didn't have a whole lot of help. But and then obviously the biggest thing for the Nuggets also is Jamal Murray came back and played like Jamal Murray again, right? Through these last couple of games. He had 24 points in game 3, right? And then, in game 4, 19, right? But he was the one that got it going, late in the second. And then also early in the third, right? He had that stretch where the Wolves were starting to make shots and he responded right back. And there was a huge swing, in the towards the end of the second quarter, right? Where, I'm sure if you watched this game, we all saw it, right? Where it's basically like 20 seconds left at the end of the second quarter, right? And they let KCP get loose for an open three, right? Like Minnesota was down 16 earlier in the game and they had cut it to 7, right? And then KCP comes in, he hits the three with 20 seconds left to put him up 10. Then Edwards is trying to split the double team. Jokic gets the steal, and then Porter Jr. gets a dunk. So now it's up to 12. And then with, a second or so left, right? I think it was Nikhil Alexander Walker, right? He tried to throw a long inbounds pass so that way they could get closer to the basket to get a score. Please don't do that if you play basketball. It's
Yes.
just not a smart. It's just not a good decision. I think.
Hmm.
Obviously, like the success rate of then Jamal Murray hits a 55-foot 3-point shot, to put it back up to 15. Like the success rate of those type of shots is very low. You just don't want to give a team an opportunity to do that, and you know, that was bad. And because again, Minnesota had gotten it back, to single digits. They battled back, and then it went right back up to 15. And then Denver was kind of able to stay afloat enough for the rest of the game where, Minnesota would make runs to get back in, and then Denver would put it right back up, because a 15-point lead, that's a relatively comfortable lead to have in a playoff game. And usually Denver doesn't lose those type of leads. And especially like there was also another swing in the third where Jokic picked up his fourth foul. He made a couple of bad decisions, I think, in terms of fouls, right? Like the tap play. I don't like those type of plays defensively either. Just either let a guy go or grab it, right? Because he had to sort of let up on some defensive plays later in the game, right? Where like Edwards gets these easy drives and there's nothing he can do because then he's going to pick up a fifth foul, um, and he can't foul out. But there was a stretch where he was out, and it was Aaron Gordon that was carrying a big part of the offense, right? He's bringing up the ball while also playing center, hitting a lot of shots. He was what 10 for 12 in the game. I mean, like including, three or four threes and a number of other, tough contested jumpers that he doesn't normally make and hadn't really made in a while, right? He had been on a cold stretch from the perimeter. But interestingly enough, game two, right, was the game where Denver got blown out, but they were going to Gordon for some jumpers and he started hitting them and he's gotten hot now. Um, and so now Denver's offense these last couple of games has looked a lot more like the Nuggets offense that, allowed them to run through the NBA last year towards the title. So a really impressive, last two games, but obviously the series isn't over. You got to, finish the job. So game five becomes an even bigger game. And now all the momentum and pressure is shifted back to Minnesota, right? Where, they're the team that has a lot of pressure to win and close out this series now. Very bad game from Towns and Gobert together. I think Towns was worse. Like Gobert, I think was okay. He
Hmm.
had some stretches like late in the game where he was missing some free throws and whatnot. But Towns was bad. Also, Nas Reed, I think offensively has been all right, but I think defensively he's been really putrid. The last couple of games where like now Jokic has adjusted. He's not bothering Jokic on defense anymore, right? Like that pretty much has been over. And I don't think it's a shocker that like now that Jokic and Murray have kind of gotten their offense back into gear, now everything else has kind of fallen into place. Obviously, their bench has also given them some huge production, right? Like Christian Brown coming off the bench, hitting some momentum shots and making plays on defense. Justin Holiday, right, replacing Peyton Watson. He comes in and he starts hitting some jumpers. So I guess I'll flip it back to you, right? So you talk about what you've seen these last couple of games, and potentially, do you think maybe we counted the Nuggets out too early, or is it still Minnesota's series, to lose?
Yeah, I think Denver has completely reawakened. It's kind of wild to see how they kind of retooled and did what we talked about, where they went back to basics, but also made some additions, like you were talking about with Aaron Gordon. But, it was really cool to see Jamal Murray kind of be revitalized because you could tell he's struggling horribly in the previous first two games, and
Right.
that what a way to bounce back, I think, for sure. But when you're looking at it from Denver's perspective, Jokic has also adapted as well. He's comfortable going up on three people, which is insane to even think about. But he's also able to find the right play, as he normally would, where he's passing to a Gordon who's standing wide open under the basket because Jokic draws so much attention. So I think Denver has potentially figured out not necessarily the kryptonite of Minnesota, but just more so a way to kind of get past that whole wall and that front that they do put up down low. And then also, like you were talking about, they don't really let Jamal Murray get harassed 94 feet all the way up the court. So that's also a plus as well. If you look at it from the Nuggets perspective again, I think the bench play has been amazing, like you talked about, to the point where if Denver's bench outplays Minnesota's bench, I think this series is a wrap, and the Nuggets will advance. However, are you going to get that every game from those guys? Maybe, maybe not. That's the problem with bench guys, but we do know that they do tend to play better at home. So I'm kind of expecting some big things from Reggie Jackson, Christian Brown, even, because I think he was like kind of one of those unsung heroes last year during their postseason run, where you don't really expect a guy with that much youth to kind of just come out there and look like a seasoned veteran. So it seems like he might be catching fire a little bit. But overall, from Minnesota's perspective, Anthony Edwards can't do it by himself. I think he had a masterclass game. He did everything the right way, I thought. The turnovers are there, but that's kind of what happens when you're on a heater like that and you're scoring 44 points. You're drawing the entire defense, and sometimes you're just going to make the bad play. But if Towns is going to play like that, this is kind of, I think, the worry that we did have about Minnesota going into this series was the fact that, how good is Towns going to be in those later rounds as the second guy? And this is probably the worst version of him because he's settling for jumpers, forcing stuff, complaining about fouls, just not good. And then alongside Gobert, not much of a threat offensively, even defensively in this game. I think the plus minus is lying to our faces right now. I thought he was horrible on defense. Conley I thought was okay, but the bench was just god awful, I think, for Minnesota, and that's been kind of the factor that I think has helped them get this far in the first place, where you've had guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker having great games, and Naz Reid being a huge X factor, but those guys didn't really show up. They were very inefficient, or like you were talking about, Naz Reid kind of getting cooked. But I think, now it's funny because we talked about it initially when Minnesota was up 2-0. We said if they do end up going up 2-0, the series might be over. But I don't know. The tide has turned completely, and the momentum has shifted completely. And I don't really know. I think it's a toss-up at this point because I don't want to count out Edwards, because I think there is a situation where if he has a game like this again and Towns actually has a good game,
Right.
I mean, I don't think the Nuggets would really stand a chance, if you want me to be honest. That would take a Jokic masterclass performance again, and also Jamal Murray would have to play, I think, a little bit better than this game, even though I think he did a much better job versus game 1 and game 2. But I think it's a toss-up. But, I mean, I want to kind of stick with our initial pick of Denver.
Right.
So that's how I kind of feel about it, just because I think the momentum has shifted. They're going back home, and I just think they're going to probably be able to finish this series, but we'll see.
Right, yeah, and if they win, I guess we can't necessarily take too much of a victory lap, because we both thought that after the first two games, it felt like it was over, for Denver, because it didn't feel like there was a lot that they could really do, and then
Right.
all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, all of a sudden, Jokic and Gordon, they're bringing up the ball. It's not Jamal Murray all the time, even and then we saw some more defensive intensity. 8 guys played, right? Like even like a Reggie Jackson, he played for like what 8.5 minutes or 9 minutes in this game, and he hit a couple of baskets, that kind of allowed them to get back in because again they started the game trailing to Minnesota, and then he comes in and hits a couple of threes because I think he missed one off the side of the backboard, right, and then he comes in and hits a couple other shots, and again like the shooting from some of these guys and these big playoff games can so many times swing a game, right? Because like Minnesota shot 39% from 3 on 28 attempts, and Denver shot 45 from on 29 attempts. So that doesn't sound like a big difference, but again, like a lot of that, some of that was like Edwards going bananas, and a lot of that was also early in the third quarter, right? Because I think Minnesota only made 11 threes, and I think they probably made like half of those just in the third. But outside of that, like they didn't really make a lot of threes in other stretches of the game, and most of it came from like 2 guys because Edwards hit 5 and Conley hit 3. Right, then you got 1 from McDaniels, 1 from Towns, who was 5 for 18 from the field, and then 1 from Naz Reid. So I mean, then and other guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 1 for 7, 0 for 4. Like some of those shots were shots that were going in against the Suns, right? Where he was, giving you like what, like 12, 15 a game with elite defense. But in these last couple of games, this shot has disappeared, right? Kyle Anderson, who played well the first couple of games, now he's been very, very bad, very, very awful, pretty much unplayable. So now it feels like Minnesota is probably going to have to shorten its rotation, where it's like probably can't see too much of Anderson anymore. You may have to see less of Naz Reid, and then you might have to see, I don't know, like Nall probably has to play because you need another guard off the bench that can defend. So then it's like, okay, now it starts to get a little bit dicey where now, okay, let's say one of the Minnesota bigs is in foul trouble. Okay, now we got to go to Reed, who hasn't played as well on defense in the series. So I don't know. Like you said, you give a lot of credit to Denver because this is what a defending champ is supposed to do, right? Like you're down 2-0, you got punched in the face the first 2 games. How do you respond, right? Like cuz we said like if this is the team that, if they're the team that we think that they should have been, they should be able to come back and
Yeah.
at least, have a chance to win the series, right? We still don't know if they're gonna win, but you can't win the title last year and then get swept because now that all of a sudden raises a lot of questions about, well, how good were you actually? I mean, obviously, I know they're dealing with, like the Jamal Murray calf stuff, but he's been, he's looked a lot better, these last couple of games. And I know
Yeah.
the game three, they had 4 days off. So I'm sure that probably did a lot to kind of get him back to, where he would like to be. But when he plays well, and this isn't really a hot take, it just makes Denver's offense just so much easier. Like Aaron Gordon was 11 for 12, right, which is nuts. But at the same time, like I mean, we were kind of wondering, hey, where are you, right? Because he was, he had 20 in game two, but a lot of that like was when the run was kind of already
Yeah.
done. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like where it felt like Minnesota was already going to win the game. Um, and then also defensively, he wasn't that great. But now we saw a masterclass Aaron Gordon performance on both ends of the floor. And, again, as we already said, the two best players on the floor, if you have those, you're gonna probably win those games and win the series. Like I obviously Edwards, he had 43 or 44 or whatever. So you can say he was the best player on the floor. But I think also Jokic had a great game. It got kind of cut short due to foul trouble. And then obviously Gordon and Murray, right? Like if you thought Edwards was one, okay, well then the next three were Denver, right? Or you could at least say Jokic and Edwards pretty close to even. And then obviously Gordon and Murray were significantly better than any of the other Minnesota players. Like it was not close. And then, kind of a wild thing was Michael Porter Jr., 4 points, 3 rebounds, was benched pretty much for most of the fourth. He was +5, but kind of hard for Denver to have a negative plus minus when they were up for most of the game, aside from the early part of the first.
Sure.
So, I mean, like, and that's also the benefit of like, okay, well, Christian Brown and Justin Holiday, they're smaller, but they probably provide more defensive versatility
Hmm.
than a guy like MPJ. And if he's just not going to be able to get off a lot of shots, because we saw this last year, it's not really much of a reason to play him. So,
Sure.
we'll see what happens. But if you're Minnesota, that's pretty rough that you won the first two games in Denver pretty decisively, and then you give it right back and lose the next two games in Minnesota very decisively. Um, so now we see what happens in Game 5, and if Denver wins that game, then it's more than likely that they're going to win the series because we know, again, kind of like the math when you're down 2-0, you're more than likely going to lose, but usually the percentage is higher when it's like if you win Game 5 in a tied series, almost all teams that win Game 5 go on to win. Like
Yeah.
obviously, it's not 100% chance, but we just know like it's kind of like the play-in where if you're 7-8, you get two chances to win one game. So if you win in Game 5 and you take a 3-2 series lead, well then now you have two chances to win one game, as opposed to if you lose Game 5, you have to win the next two. You can't lose any more games because then your series is over.
Yeah.
And then obviously, if it gets to Game 7, that's in Denver, right? So you would think that they would probably have a lot of a momentum and advantage in a home game, winner take all, right? Like obviously we saw Minnesota win the first two, but we'll see. Because again, if Jokic and Murray play the way they've played, then that's probably a wrap. You know what I mean? Like it's just I think it's going to be harder, to expect Minnesota to be able to win if Jokic and Murray play the way they play. Plus, if you get a crazy performance from a third guy like an Aaron Gordon, and like you said, if the Denver bench outplays Minnesota's bench, because that's not supposed to happen
Right.
in theory, because Denver has one of the weakest benches in the NBA, right? By a lot of the numbers. But
Yeah.
if all of a sudden their bench is a positive, right? Like their bench guys had most of the highest plus minuses other than Gordon. So if that's gonna happen, yeah, then you got a problem. I mean, like, and like look at some of these, like Kyle Anderson -20 in 6 minutes. That
Hmm.
is very difficult to do.
Yep.
And not in a good way.
Yeah.
Um Actually no, he was -18 in
Yeah.
6 minutes, but still, like that's still awful.
It was
Um
Alexander Walker who was -20.
yeah, which is also bad. So
Yes.
I mean, like, that's a problem. So that needs to, be shored up. Edwards has got to get some help, but again, sometimes that's the difficulty of when your second best player is Carl Anthony Towns. Like we've seen, like again, he's not a bad player, but we know sometimes he's going to make some intriguing decisions, right? Because he had a couple of offensive fouls where it's like, what are you doing, right? Or I think he had a couple of fouls where he was picking up Jokic like 70 feet. Like I just
Yes.
don't understand why you would do that. Like like that's what we talked about. Like when the bigs are bringing up the ball, it makes it harder for Minnesota to ball pressure because if you do, like, you almost have to do it with your bigs, which you just can't do because if you do it with the guards or the forwards, congratulations, like you have a mismatch with Jamal Murray or Aaron Gordon or whomever.
Right.
Um, but if the bigs do it, they're not quick enough to be able to do that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, like, like if you watch, I don't know, Denver, right, on defense, like Jokic is not going to be ball pressuring, anybody.
No.
Like, it's just not going to happen. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, like, it just doesn't. So, like, I mean, I don't know, like some strange decisions by Minnesota, but also at the same time, you do have to give credit to Denver, who they are the defending champs. And in these two games, they've shown who we thought they were supposed to be. Right, going into the playoffs, this was our pick to win the title. I know at the beginning of the season that was your pick; they were not mine. But going into the playoffs, right, they were both of our picks. And if they keep playing like that, then they might be on their way. But it's only going to get harder because again, going back to back, a lot of fatigue, a lot of stuff you have to push through, better competition. But if they can get out of this series alive, I think it becomes significantly more likely that they'll come out of the West and win the title.
Yeah, agreed. And it's like, I do want to talk about Minnesota a little bit more because I think, now their postseason run is clearly in jeopardy, and that's something that I think we didn't expect because they had the 2-0 lead, and it's kind of crazy. Like you really think about it, the trip to the Western Conference Finals was pretty much right in the palm of their hand, and now they've kind of created a whole botch job of it. And what do you think like the keys to success for them should be going forward? Because obviously I think Anthony Edwards is going to probably have another good game and continue to play well for the rest of the series. I think it just really comes down to Towns, if you want me to be honest, and probably a mix between Towns and Gobert. I would probably just say the two front court guys. They need to be amazing on probably both ends of the floor, which is a hard ask because Towns is not the greatest offensive or defensively, and Gobert is not the greatest offensively, which is kind of rough. And I don't really know where you go from there because I think the Nuggets are kind of primed to kind of exploit that because they have a walking mismatch in Aaron Gordon. Then if Michael Porter Jr. kind of catches fire along with Jokic, I mean that's wraps.
Yeah, because I mean, like the thing is that like through the first two games, Edwards and Towns were the two best players on the floor. So, Jokic and Jamal Murray were just awful, right? Like they were, especially Murray. Like Jokic was really bad too, and like especially in the game too, because you would think, as the best player on the team, he'd be going out swinging. But now it's flipped. So, the question is that like, okay, you know, now that do have Jokic and Murray gotten their bad games out of the way? I think to be fair, I guess you could also make the case that the way that the game has been officiated is a little bit different than it was. I think in the first couple of games,
100%.
right? Where like the first couple of games, especially in game two, right? They were pretty much letting everything go without a whistle at all, right? But now in these last couple of games, now the whistle is a lot more tight, where they're calling stuff more, and I think that for sure benefits the Nuggets. And again, like maybe you could say in game two, like there should have been a tighter whistle, and then like maybe in games three and four, maybe you say, okay, maybe you need to go back. And that's kind of the tough part from game to game, but also like these teams have to adjust, right? Like if you're Minnesota, you're the number one defense in the NBA. So, and I'm sure they've had games during the regular season where like the whistle was not necessarily as favorable to them, and they still, I'm sure, were probably able to win. Obviously, it's the playoffs. Playoffs are different from the regular season, but you just kind of have to adjust, I think, to the whistle. You kind of have to get a grasp of it early on. Some of the fouls Minnesota were committing, some of them were just kind of dumb. I think where it's like, why are you doing this? Like I'm sure there were some that were questionable calls for sure, especially compared to the first couple of games. But Denver's got the momentum now. They've made their adjustments. So now you mentioned, the Minnesota keys. Again, Edwards is going to have to keep playing the way he's been playing. And then I think, in addition to that, like, yeah, like you need more, you need just better production, I think, from some of the other guys. Like Towns can't go 5 for 18 in an 8 point loss, right? Because again, like, if some of his shots went in, that changes it. But then also, like, there were some things he was doing. Like, I think in this game, he was posting up a lot more, and it just wasn't working,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, the first two games, he was playing more downhill and then kind of allowing, like, okay, I'm playing downhill. Now they're playing me for the drive. I'm a 40% 3 point shooter. So let me step into my shot. But I think Denver's defense has adjusted more. We're like, now we're not just going to let you barrel down to the basket. Or if you do, we're going to be smarter about how we're going to guard it. So you're not just going to waltz to the free throw line. you're going to be forced to put up some tougher shots. So that's where I think like you're probably just going to have to be better in terms of offensive execution from some of these guys. And then, like, I mean, I don't know, like defensively, I think you're gonna have to start making some adjustments. Because I know, like in this game, the last couple of games, like Aaron Gordon hasn't shot well from three for most of the playoffs. So, like, and we've seen a lot of teams do this where it's like this guy's not a great 3-point shooter, leave him open. Well, now he's making them. So
Yeah.
I guess the question is, do you continue to gamble with that and say like he'll miss eventually? Because Denver has shot the ball very well in these last couple of games. So do you expect maybe a regression to the mean where he's back to not shooting as well? Or do you have to switch up the defensive coverage and be like, well, now we have to play him for his jump shot? So that's where I think there's going to have to be some 50-50 decisions that are going to have to be made, there as well. Because those type of performances, can swing a series, right? Where like if Aaron Gordon shoots the way he had shot earlier in the postseason, then, obviously things are different, right? But, if he's all of a sudden caught fire, then, that makes a huge difference. So, but then you can also flip it to where, okay, because that could also be like why Michael Porter Jr. had like 5 points, because clearly they're laser focused on not letting him get off a ton of shots because we know he's a very good 3-point shooter. So
So
that's the gamble you make. If you put more attention on him, then all of a sudden that allows for more opportunities for a guy like Gordon. But if he starts making them, then you got to change it up. So, but then if you change that up, then that might go back to, MPJ getting some open looks. It's tough. So, Denver has a lot of different things they can do on offense. So if their offense is cooking like that, I don't know. But I think for Minnesota, they are a defensive first team. So I think it also has to start with a better defensive approach
yes.
where I think you're just going to have to, start making some changes in terms of how you're guarding certain guys. But it's always a gamble because again, like their identity is their defense, right? Like the Nuggets are the offensive oriented team that can defend.
Mhm.
Minnesota is a defensive oriented team, that at times, can get some stuff done on offense, but mainly because of Edwards, right? Like, if Edwards doesn't have a great game, this offensive ceiling is significantly lower because he's the one guy that I don't think Denver has too much of an answer for. But you can live with a 40-point Edwards game if nobody else really shows up, right? The problem was in game one, he had the 40-point game and everybody else also showed up.
Right.
So, that's where we'll have to see, what happens.
Right, because I feel like this might be a little bit hot takey, but in game three, I think it kind of speaks to what you were just talking about, where Anthony Edwards didn't have like the best game. It was okay, but by no means what we're kind of accustomed to and what he's
Him and
done through the playoffs.
both him and Towns were bad at game.
Exactly, and it's like I think when you get that version, and they're
Yeah.
not playing defense, I think that's a really bad combo.
Yeah.
But then you look at Denver and what they were able to do in game three, complete flip flop. And I don't know.
Right.
I really don't know where this goes because,
Yeah.
like I said, I don't want to count out Anthony Edwards and, Minnesota because I think they have what it takes to, make Denver uncomfortable, which is what we saw in game 1 and 2. They just need to keep it up and make adjustments. And I think, another factor that's kind of interesting, probably isn't, all that important, but, Micah Nori being out there instead of, Finch, which is crazy. To even be in that situation in the first place, where your head coach is sitting behind you in the bench, like that's kind of wild to think about. But yeah, I think they do need to make some adjustments, and I think real time adjustments would help this team a lot versus making them game to game, because I think Denver they for sure adjusted in real time, like you're
Yeah.
talking about, adjusting who the primary ball handler is. And just taking pressure off for some guys and then having guys rotate in at the exact right time, especially due to foul trouble and things like that. So I think coaching is for sure a factor in this as well.
Because you got to think about it this way
Mm-hmm.
from Minnesota's perspective, right? Like the first two games, part of why they were also scoring so much was because of all the stops they were getting,
Yes,
right? Like
sir.
that significantly helps, because offense and defense are tied together. So like when their defense is, stifling, they can use that to get into some of their offense, right? Because they can get out in transition, right? You're not going against a set defense as much, right? A guy like Edwards can just get out on the open floor and run. And it just allows you to attack better, right? Like when the other team just isn't able to score at all. But now the Nuggets offense is flowing, so now it's their game because I don't think Minnesota can go in a back and forth offensive, you know, tit for tat against the Nuggets. I just don't think their offense unless everybody's playing well, is necessarily capable of doing that, especially 4 out of 7. Although in this case, they just have to win two more.
Right.
So that's where like the team that sets the terms of the agreements and kind of sets the tone. That's who's going to win. Like, and I mean that sounds like a very generic cliche thing, but I'm just
It's
saying
the
like for
truth.
Minnesota, it has to start on the defensive end because I just don't think the defense has been sharp the last couple of games. It was better in this game for sure than it was in game 3, right? Which is why it was closer, but also like Edwards scoring 40 whatever points helped because there were some stretches where like just boneheaded. Like the end of that second quarter, you could say that was kind of like what probably allowed the Nuggets to pull out the win because
Yeah.
to go from 7 up down 7 to down 15 in 20 seconds. I mean, that can't happen in the playoffs, right?
Yeah.
It's just especially because we know like the Nuggets do the thing where they kind of run out the clock, and kind of, waste time. Not in a bad way, but like let's say in the fourth quarter, like they know that they can get some good offense for the most part, even like down to like 20 seconds. So
Sure.
they can run the clock down. Whereas like Minnesota, you saw like when they would get a stop, they had to go out and run because they're playing from behind. So
Yes.
that's where Minnesota, I think the biggest adjustments have to come from the defense. And that's because that's how they're going to win most games, right? Because it's the defense, and then the defense leads to the offense being better. Because that's just how it's going to work, right? Because and we'll get into these other games. It's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah.
So, moving on, right? I guess another series, that kind of went one way and then went another way. New York Knicks versus the Pacers, right? Game 3, I kind of thought was the swing game because I think we both thought even after game 2, we thought, okay, the OG Anunoby is bad, but the Knicks, if they can just win one of these games in Indiana, they've got the series,
Mm-hmm.
and they managed to drop both of them. Game 3, I think, is the one that was if they lose the series, that was probably the series because they were playing poorly early on, got it back, briefly had like a 9 point lead in the fourth, and then it was back and forth. And you kind of saw without Ananobi, all right, now we're giving up offensive rebounds. Without Randall, we don't have another scoring option. And even despite all of that, they still had a chance. And then Andrew Nemhard, just hits a dagger shot. Like, I know there was still time left. When that shot went in, like,
It was
that game
over.
was over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was over. And, like, it kind of carried over into this game where from the start, Indiana just ran them off the floor, right? Like they won by 32 points, wasn't close literally at all. Um, it was bad, right? And like I think you can kind of see now that like the Knicks probably have ran out of gas, where it's like, okay, if you had won game 3 and gone up 3-0, you could probably survive OG being out because you literally would have to lose 4 straight games. But now you just don't have enough pressure. You just don't have enough time left necessarily because he's probably not going to play in game 5. I think they already said he still can't run. So if he's not able to run, he's probably not going to. Obviously, he's going to be out for game 5. Probably going to be out for game 6, and then that might be that. So this was a series where we thought the Knicks were going to win. It looked like it the first 2 games, but it is the first of 4. Um, and the Pacers have now completely flipped it. Obviously, we'll see what happens going back to New York. But I don't know. It just kind of feels like now you may not have much of a chance left because, in this game, the Knicks were pretty abysmal, right? Like Josh Hart had 2 points, only 3 rebounds. I mean, they didn't play that many minutes anyways because like they were down like what 20 or 30 at halftime, so they didn't play as many minutes anyways. So now it kind of feels like a lot of the stuff that we were concerned about in terms of them making a deep run. Now it's caught up, right? We're like Ananobi hurts his hamstring because he's playing a lot. Brunson's hurt his foot. Obviously, like Indiana has a couple of guys out, right? Like what was it, Benedict Matherin, right? He's out. Is there somebody else out?
I think that's the only one.
Okay, but like either way, like so that's one guy out. But like for the Knicks, obviously, like their losses are even more significant. And this is why, like when we talked about like, when some people might say they don't need Julius Randle, and it's like, yeah, they do. Like if they want to make a deeper run, like just because even though he's not a guy that's generally been great in the postseason, it's nice to have another guy you can turn to offensively, and it just makes everybody else's roles easier, right? Like DiVincenzo had what 35 or 36 in game 3,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and he had 7 in this game, right? Like Brunson was 6 for 17, Miles McBride was 6 of 17. Alec Burks had 20. He was kind of the hero for a little bit for the Knicks in game 3. but it just feels like they're just out of gas. Like, and that's kind of the issue there. So I don't know, like where this is gonna go, but it does feel like now that they're probably gonna lose to Indiana. Could be wrong, um, but I don't know. If you're the Knicks, like this is why losing that game 3 was really rough because, like I said, if they had won that game, I think even without OG, they could probably win a game. Because worst case scenario, even if it gets all the way down to game 7, you'd still have one more chance, and maybe Anunoby comes back. But the longer the series goes, the more likely the Pacers win because fatigue is going to take over.
Sure, and I think that's fair.
Yeah, and to be fair, the Pacers have also played significantly better in these last 2 games, including Halliburton, who's been great. Like that's the other thing, because I also want to look at it from the Pacers' perspective,
Hmm.
where they've got some better performances out of certain guys. Like Siakam was horrible the first 2 games. He's been a lot better these last couple of games. Like a TJ McConnell, they're playing him more. He's been really, really good in this series. Isaiah Jackson, who is a guy who didn't really play much in the first round. He's a better matchup against the Knicks and who just don't have the size and the rebounding capabilities anymore at this point. So we'll see what happens, but yeah, can't say congratulations yet because the series isn't over, but
Yeah.
it feels like the Pacers are probably going to win the series because in a battle of attrition, they just have more guys and they're playing better now than they did play the first couple of games, and that is credit to Indiana as well.
Yeah. And it's like, the way that I look at the way the series has gone this far, obviously the injury luck is horrid for New York, prayers on that. But, in regards to how the series has actually gone, I think it's gone kind of the way that it's really supposed to. Both teams have won
Yeah,
both their games at home, which is kind of
yeah,
how, and the point of having, home court and being able to play at home, that's the point of it. So, in my opinion, I'm not really worried about the Knicks as much, maybe as you are, where you're talking about, a battle of attrition. I think, they just need to get home, get in a better environment because Indiana's a hostile environment. Today, watching that game, that was hard to watch in
yeah.
terms of, like nothing was going their way and they just got drowned out completely. The crowd showed up, like you talked about. Everybody on the Pacers pretty much scored, in double digits. That was a factor. TJ McConnell coming off the bench, that helped a lot. He ignited everything. It was just an onslaught of everything. And I think, New York will respond defensively, I think, when they do go back. It's just a matter of who are you going to play because there's not a lot of guys who are healthy. In this game, we saw some Jericho Sims minutes, which is hilarious because I think in our previous episode, we thought that he was probably not going to see any kind of minutes along with Alec Burks or any of those guys, but they did play, obviously, granted, crazy blowout numbers, but regardless, I think they're going to bounce back because I don't really foresee DiVincenzo having another game where he's minus 40 or, anything of that nature. I think Josh Hart will play better in the next game. I know this is probably a hot take to a lot of people, but I think Jalen Brunson probably won't play as bad as he has in the past couple of games. So I'm not as worried, but to all the Randall haters, I think this is kind of proof as to why you really do need him because I think
Yeah.
you can't say, yeah, I'd rather have Precious Achua than Julius Randle in the starting five.
Right.
And
Yeah.
this is exactly what happens when you don't have another option outside of Brunson. Some guys are cold. DiVincenzo got cooked. You're not healthy. Simple as that.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. Indiana's had a very, very lucky run in terms of injuries because every team that they've played thus far has kind of caught a wild injury bug or something, in terms of fatigue. But I mean, I don't think the series is over per se, but I will say it does really feel like it at times because, you look at Indiana and what they're able to do, the pace that they play at, and their offense has just been on another level, and it continued in this game.
And that's the other thing. If it, for the offense, if it turns into a Halliburton series, then that's the other problem, right? Because like a big part of if you're the Knicks trying to win the series, either Brunson has to be the best player on the floor,
Hmm.
or the Knicks starters have to outplay, the Pacers, starting five or
Yeah,
whatever, right?
and their
But if
bench.
it's all, yeah, and their bench. But all of a sudden, if Halliburton is like the best guy on the floor, and then other guys for Indiana shows up, that's where it's gonna flip. So, I think the part that you said about like this is kind of how it should go. I think that's a good point because like I would have been pretty shocked like if the Knicks had gone up like if we had gone into the series like because I think we both picked the Knicks, but
Hmm.
like and I think we had, what was it, the Homelander in the chat. He thought it was going to be a sweep, which I didn't think. But like,
Yeah.
if the Knicks had gone up 3-0, like I would have been just shocked personally
Right.
because I just wouldn't have felt that this wouldn't have felt like a series where either team could go up 3-0. Um, and it looked like it might happen, right? But then it didn't. So, that's where like and that's why, like, because I think there was like a thought process where I think there was a reporter that asked the Knicks about, like, why don't you just tank game three?
Hmm.
And it's like, if they had won game three, that's why you don't tank it, right?
Right.
Because they were very close to winning that game. And if they had won the game and they had gone up 3-0, then the series is done no matter what. Like, I mean, obviously, like, yeah, technically the Pacers could come back
Right.
or whatever, but like you just have so much, room for error if you're up 3-0, right? Because then it's like, okay, now we already stole one in Indiana. So, now literally nothing matters. Like we got 4 chances to win one game. But now that they've lost that game, that's a huge swing. So we'll see. Like you said, maybe they go back to New York and maybe they run Indiana out of the gym, right? Or something like that. We haven't seen the Knicks really blow out a team yet, right? Because like all the Philly games were pretty close. Um, and then I think the Knicks, they ended up beating Indiana by double digits in game two, but like it wasn't necessarily a blowout. So who knows? But there's no way that can happen unless they have a hot shooting night. And the hot shooting night was in game three,
Right.
right? Because they shot pretty well from the field, and from three in that game. So you lose a game where you shoot the ball pretty well if you're the Knicks. That's rough because then look at this game: 34 from the field, 18.9% from three, even 71% from the line. Like that's just rough. And they missed some free throws down the stretch of game three as well. So that's, and again, like the Nemhard shot. If the Pacers win the series, that was the moment where the Pacers won the series. And sometimes playoff series can come down to that, where it's like somebody could be a star, could be a starter, could be a role player, just comes in and hits a big shot, makes a big play, and that completely flips the series, right? Like,
Yeah.
go back to Cleveland. I know this is a finals. That was a finals matchup, right? But go back to Cleveland Golden State, right? It's game seven. Neither team had scored for like a minute or two or whatever. Game is tied. Kyrie hits a three. They go up three, right? Like, a shot like that can kind of win you a
And
series,
that's
right?
after the LeBron block too. So
Exactly, right? Yeah, because at one point Cleveland was down, and then I think LeBron got fouled on a three, hit all three,
hmm
then hits a three, then it's tied. I think no, Clay hits a shot, and then nobody scores for like 2-3
it
minutes.
was like
Like it's
89-89 for like
yeah,
3 whole
exactly,
minutes.
exactly. So and then you can go to whatever other series you want to go to, right? There's always some moment where somebody hits a big shot or makes a big play or makes a big blunder and it completely swings a game, right?
Yeah.
Because we've definitely seen blunders, right, that completely swing a game, right? Like, we've seen it before, right? Like obviously, you can speak to them because we've seen many playoff games, right? Like I think it was, what was it? It was the Spurs Heat game, right? Where it's like Kawhi misses a free throw, something like that. And then all of a sudden Ray Allen comes in and hits a three, right? Because they get an offensive rebound,
Yeah.
right? Ginobili throws the ball away, stuff
hmm
like that. Just, kind of like these weird plays where like things happen, people make mistakes, or people make great plays, and like that swings the series. So credit to Nemhard, especially because in that game he wasn't even really that good.
He was like 1 for 7 at the time of hitting that shot, or that shot might have made him 1 for. I can't remember exactly what his stat line was, but he was very, very bad.
He made one shot before that, so that
Mhm.
was his second make. So stuff like that. It's rough if you're the other team. If you're on the losing end of it, bad, right? Because that's the kind of stuff that can completely flip a series, and it may not feel like it at the time, but then sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Because literally in the last round, we saw Tyrese Maxey score 28 points in seven, or not 28, my bad, 7 points in 28 seconds,
Mhm.
and then just the game completely flips. But then it didn't matter because then the Knicks ended up winning the next game and then the series.
Right.
But if the Knicks go on to lose that series, that's the moment where, where they lost.
Yeah, and it's like in game 3, I thought the Knicks played a really good game, which is hilarious. It was just that final minute, 2 minute stretch was really, really tough to watch. And like
And Miles,
that's what you were talking about, where it's like you ran out of gas. Like I get what Jalen Brunson was trying to do. I mean, but at the end of the day, you probably weren't going to draw that foul over 3
no,
people, being real, on a step through 3. But at the end of the
yeah,
day, it's also funny. Like DiVincenzo had like a amazing game. Josh Hart, they all shot well, like you talked about,
Yeah.
51% from the three, but they just
Like,
dropped the ball. They ran out of gas.
yeah, those are the type of games that you can't lose where you get big contributions from other players because you can't expect DiVincenzo to have 35 points every game. Like it's not going to happen. He's just not that type of player, right? Like he's really good, but he's not a guy that should be averaging like 25 points a game in a playoff series. It just that's just not normal, right? Like, and that's not an insult to him. It's just he's not, that type of player.
Hmm.
And you don't want to necessarily be in a situation like that where you're, leaving the chance like, okay, like we have to win 4 games where DiVincenzo scores 25 a game, but that's the position that they're in because they don't have too many other guys. Like, but again, that's the point of like you said and like I said, like Randall, like in the offseason, maybe you look to move him, but as long as he's on the team, there's no way you can say that you're better without him. Like you just can't. Like that's never a thing. Like even like Minnesota, like if Towns isn't out there, like you're better with him than you are without him, as long as he's on the team. Maybe you can say we're better off moving him for other pieces, but if he's on the team, you need him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So now moving on to another series, OKC, Dallas. This hurts because we picked OKC to win this series. And they dropped the ball the last 2 games where they had an opportunity to win. And Dallas snatched it from them.
Yeah.
And the way that they've played in these last couple of games, that's the formula where it's like, okay, Dallas, even though they're not a team that has a bunch of title guys, they do have some, like you have Kyrie. I mean, you have other guys who have been in some big playoff series. So that's where the experience kicks in for them. But also, it's kind of like when Anthony Edwards said, like, yeah, they got Durant, we got Jaden McDaniels. Like OKC has Shea, but Dallas has PJ Washington, right? Like, when stuff like that happens in a playoff series, it's like what I talked about in the last one, right? Like with Aaron Gordon, because PJ Washington, 5 of 12 from three. A lot of those, misses came in the fourth because there was a point where he must have hit like 4 or 5, without missing a single one.
Hmm.
But the problem was for OKC, he had already hit those, and Dallas was still in the game. So that left plenty of opportunities for Luka and Kyrie to come in at the end in the fourth quarter and basically close it out for them,
Hmm.
right? I thought the bigs for Dallas, in these games, right, have been huge for them, right? Where it's like, they're playing well on both ends of the floor, kind of causing some problems for OKC in terms of the size and length. Even a Tim Hardaway Jr. or Josh Green coming in and, hitting some big shots. Um, Derek Jones Jr. right 1 for 10 in what was it, game 3, but again, still providing some value on the other end of the floor. And then for OKC, you just see some of the problems in terms of the inexperience. Like Shea, SGA had 31, 10, and 6, 5 blocks, but he had 5 fouls, and in the fourth quarter, he was kind of shut out of the game. Um, Chet Holmgren had 13 and 8 and 4 blocks, right? But a lot of those buckets came in the fourth when the game kind of felt like, it was teetering, maybe out of reach. Jalen Williams, 16 and 8 and 6. But, like you can kind of tell, like he's still a work in progress, right? Like he's in year 2, trying to, throw these scoop layups in. It's not working. Lou Dort, 3 for 9, fouled out, you know, kind of a funny back and forth between him and Luca for most of the series. Um, and then Josh Giddey, right? Where it's like, okay, he was -1. And I understand like, a lot of coaches are not gonna go away from guys, that got them there. But I just feel like this is just not the series for him. Like maybe you might be able to get away with him coming off the bench, but even there, like I don't know. Like he had a stretch in the third. I think where OKC built up a lead in the second half, where I think like he hit a three and then got a layup. But like outside of that, like he just hasn't been playable. And like this is the problem that we talked about going into the series, where if he's going to play, he has to be good. Because he's not like some of these other guys where they have value on, on other in other areas, even when the shot's not falling. Because it becomes a problem where it's like, you know, he took 8 shots, 1 of 4 from three. Like some of those shots go to other guys if he's not out there, right? Like, he's just kind of forcing him into these positions where he has to shoot. Sometimes he's passing up open shots, passing up layups because he's not trusting. I mean, he's taking the threes. It's just like, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of hard because it's like there are other guys that didn't really do a whole lot either. But, both of these games were winnable games for OKC. It's just, even Mark Dagnall, I think, has made, some tactical errors where we can see defensively, like, there's some problems where some guys are over helping, and it's like, let Chet do his thing. But also, to be fair, he's one guy, and he's skinny. But then, you also kind of just look at, some of the decisions where it's like, okay, it's a tough spot because you're conceding open shots to a guy like PJ Washington, so that way, like, Luca doesn't have as many gaps to attack. He's not throwing as many lobs up to the bigs. But now PJ Washington is hitting every single shot in the corner, right? So now it's like, okay, what do you do? Do you keep giving it up? He was missing them in the second half, but now, okay, now Luca and Kyrie have it going. So it's like, okay, well, now if you guard PJ Washington, well, now you're giving up the lobs. Now you're giving up some of the other shots, like we talked about with the Nuggets Timberwolves. So you almost kind of have to pick your poison. And sometimes series come down to that, where it's like if a guy who's not considered an elite 3-point shooter turns into a 40% 3-point shooter, you're gonna lose, right? Like if PJ Washington has 27 in a game and essentially was pretty much better than any non-Shea OKC player, it's done because you can't expect Luca and Kyrie to be bad for 4 straight quarters, um, and that's tough, right? But again, this is where maybe we jumped the gun on picking OKC to win the series. Maybe we should have gone with our guts and picked Dallas to win the series, even though OKC had been very good all season, and it felt like a lot of what they do on offense can give Dallas some problems. But Dallas has also played some pretty good defense. We've seen zone defense that's kind of limited some of the stuff that OKC likes to do, where now Shea has these tougher drives and he's kind of forced to be in like a really aggressive mode that kind of takes other guys out of the game. But then it's
Hmm.
like, okay, what can you really turn to? You know what I mean? So it's like, that's kind of the tough part there. We'll see if OKC responds because they did create some good shots as well, but they also, like, again, they shot 33% from three. Um, and so it's like, that's the other factor where it's like, hey, like in some of these games, they're generating good offense. Um, and like there are some stretches where there are some boneheaded mistakes, that put them in rough spots as well. But then there's also stretches, like I said, where they're getting good shots and they're not converting. So, we'll see where this goes. But if I'm OKC, I would not feel good about this at all because you had two very winnable games. And I'm not going to say that they gave them away because Dallas took them and won these games fair and square. But at the same time, if you're OKC, it's rough because what happens if there's one game where all of a sudden every single shot for Dallas goes in and like Luca and Kyrie, they can't miss. Their other supporting cast guys, they can't miss. That could happen, right? That could happen, at home in game 4. And that's a big swing game. Because if OKC wins game 4, they can get right back into this series. We both thought like this is a 6-7 game series anyway. So it's not like it's over. But obviously OKC has to win this next game.
Yeah.
And it's tough because they could have won either one of these games, but you know, that's the tough part of a young team where now you got to figure out what you got to do. Like I said, I think you just can't really play Josh Giddey too much anymore. I mean, I guess who do you start? If that's the case, do you start Isaiah Joe? Do you start Case and Wallace? I mean, it would also help like if Hayward was actually good, because then like maybe you could kind of consider maybe starting him and just being like, let's have 3 forwards out there, but you can't because he's just been bad. Like, and
Yeah.
that's the part that hurts because not that we can say, oh, if they had Davis Bertans, yeah, they'd be sitting pretty up 2-1 at this point. Like, who
Right.
else did they? Um, it was the guard. What was his name? Um, the
Trey
Tech
Man.
Hudson, Trey
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying that if they had Trey Man and Davis Bertans, they'd be up 2-1. Like, that's not at all what I'm saying.
Sure.
I'm just like, that's where like if Hayward could be good, that could help, right? Because like in theory, he could do some of the Josh Giddey stuff, but he's a much better shooter. But with him just being washed, that's rough because then it's like because I think that would be the ideal replacement if you want to say we want Payson Wallace, Isaiah Joe, and Aaron Wiggins to come off the bench. So if that's the case, it almost feels like you might have to start one of those other 3 guys, but then like that might hurt your bench because like can Josh Giddey really command the second units? I don't know. Like I don't know. That's the issue. So
Yeah.
you're OKC. What do you do? And then also in terms of Dallas, what do they need to continue to do?
Yeah, there's so much going on in this series. It's kind of giving me like a whole overload sensory thing, headache. It's insane. Like there's actually so many battles within it. Like you talked about. Firstly, I think you do have to give credit. I think to Dallas's big men for sure. They've done an amazing job at limiting, the paint play, which is what you were talking about. Like I'm just gonna throw out some stats here. They were ranked. The Thunder were ranked among the top 10 in the league during the regular season in points in the paint, but that's dipped by 8 points, throughout the Western Conference semifinals. So that tells you, they're not as efficient and they're not scoring at a high volume in the paint as much as they would like to, for sure. And I think you do have to credit, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, both those guys for just pretty much taking OKC out of their game plan, which is, I think, unexpected. I didn't think they could do that. I thought they would be a factor for sure, but I didn't think they could completely mitigate it. And I think SGA has definitely been the guy who's been most affected, like you talked about. It's tough. He's being forced into these really contested shots, and he gets to the line, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you're not really converting sometimes. But at the end of the day, also another factor for sure. I didn't expect OKC to be able to limit Luka and Kyrie Irving in the way that they have, but I don't understand why you keep leaving PJ Washington open. I get it, like you're talking about the gamble, and they've even addressed this in the post game conferences and press conferences and stuff like that. Dagnott said we know he's a really good player, but you have to determine what your priorities are. If you have 10 priorities against a team, that's where you really hemorrhage. So you've got to determine your priorities. We think we've done that. In my opinion, I don't think you have at all. I get what he's trying to say, where they're trying to take Kyrie and Luka out of the game to the point where they're making these guys, attempt some pretty open shots, which is, I get the logic. You don't want Kyrie to go off, you don't want Luka to go off, which is cool. They're commanding a lot of attention, which is good. But at the end of the day, I would rather lose a series to Kyrie and Luka than lose a series to PJ Washington averaging 28 points over the past couple of games, if that makes sense. I know that might be like a hot take, but I think they need to reorder their priorities at the end of the day. And I think they'll rally. I think they'll bounce back. I don't think the series is over by any means. It's just this is a clear momentum shift, and I think it was clearly unexpected, because I think you could live with being down 2-1 to Dallas, but I feel like it's more so they're down 2-1 to PJ Washington. And this is what we talked about, where the complementary players were so key in this series, where PJ Washington is balling out of his mind, but then you got Josh Giddey, who kind of doesn't even look like he really belongs out there. And then also the other complementary guys on OKC. J-Dub has been okay. I'm not going to say he's been amazing. Chet, I think, has been a little underwhelming offensively. Giddey has given you nothing pretty much offensively. And the other guys, I think they're sparking up threes on the bench, but it's just not enough compared to, once again, PJ Washington. And I just don't know what you can really do from there. Maybe fix some rotations. And I think that comes with the youth, the inexperience, also the coaching as well. It's a young coach. But I think defensively they'll find a way to kind of maybe jump some lanes, just not leave, PJ wide open. I don't have an issue if PJ Washington's kind of just sparking threes and he's contested off the catch and shoot. But, I mean, these are wide open shots where it's like there's no rotation because they're trying to clog the lane for Luka and Kyrie. So I get what they're doing, but I think they're going to adjust.
Like from a Dallas perspective, like Jason Kidd's done some good stuff. Like there was a stretch, and they don't do it a lot at all, but I remember I think it was in game 2 where OKC went really, really small, and then they had a couple of stretches where they were like, let's run some PJ Washington post ups, right? And it's and that's and I think kind of the PJ Washington piece is kind of where, okay, you don't really miss Maxi Kleba, because now we're just going to stretch out PJ Washington's minutes, right? He played 40, I think, in game 3.
Mm-hmm.
So and stuff like that, right? Where it's okay, well, now we don't really miss him that much, because it's
Right.
Washington can do a lot of the same stuff. Obviously, he's not as I guess quote unquote as big as Maxi Kleba, but also I would also say please, if you're the Mavs, please don't say yeah, we lost the series because we didn't have Maxi Kleba. That's not how this is supposed to go.
Right.
You're always going to have certain key players, gone. in certain series. Like, and some of these teams don't. Like OKC is pretty healthy, for the most part. But, just in general, like, I think I've liked a lot of the stuff that Kid has done. And like, some of the OKC stuff, it's kind of questionable, right? Like, to be honest, like the Hack a Lively thing was funny, but also I don't personally usually like that kind of strategy because I just think it kind of like takes you out of your offense. And like the thing for OKC was like I don't like they didn't really score off of that. Like instead I think they were just turnovers, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like, okay, like you like he missed some of the free throws, but then he ended up shooting 8 for 12. So like you're just like and obviously like you're playing the numbers because he's not a great free throw shooter. I understand that. And like, there were some that he missed and then they still didn't get to take advantage. I just think like okay, you know, rather than just doing that, why don't you just play defense and then just get out and transition, get out and run? Like, I mean, as opposed to just doing that. And like sometimes it works, but I feel like a lot of times, I feel like it's just kind of like a gimmick. Bless you, I feel like a lot of times it doesn't work. It just feels kind of amateurish. You know what I mean? Like, it kind of feels like something like a high school coach, would probably do, when they don't really have anything else to lean on. Like, I mean, I just feel like you can do better than that, right? Like, I get it because he's not a good free throw shooter, but like also like, what did you accomplish from that? Like,
Yeah.
not really much of anything.
And we
So
haven't seen that in a very long time. And the
it,
the, the
yeah,
funny thing is, what's up?
yeah, and some of that is because there's not that many like terrible free throw shooters that are playing big minutes in playoff games anymore.
Sure. And another thing that's kind of funny is I feel like this is odd, but somehow true is like Dallas has kind of been outworking and out hustling the Thunder, which is a complete flip. I thought it was going to be the other way around. I thought OKC was going to be the team to kind of get out and run and all that stuff, but if we look at like rebounds, the Mavericks have owned that in terms of advantages, second chance points. And then also fast break points, points in the paint. It's been everything. They basically owned every category in terms of like hustling and getting out there. So I think
Yeah,
we're probably going to see a better version of OKC, especially with their backs against the wall, because it is a must win and they have to win the next game or else I'm not going to say like the series is over, but it's teetering to that direction. And I mean, I
yeah.
think
You lose.
the youth and inexperience is showing from the coach and the players. But at the end of the day, you're also getting kind of outworked.
Yeah, and I also want to mention like the stars for Luca and Kyrie because they haven't had like 40 in any of these
Mm-hmm.
games, but they've had some like really big important plays where like
Mm-hmm.
Kyrie's making some great plays in terms of his playmaking and defense and rebounding as well. Because he's keeping these guys in the game like when they have the second units and even like a Luca right who had 22 and shot 7 for 17, but he also had 15 rebounds right like and he was like and he kind of stopped settling for like some of the really tough shots. I mean, there were some, but like just in general, he kind of used his size and strength and muscle to his advantage. Like, I mean, again, he had 15 rebounds. That was, and that, which is kind of funny because Shea had 10 rebounds. So like the guards have been doing their thing in terms of being active on the boards. And Luca's, not the same type of guard, obviously, but you know, I just want to give the Dallas Stars, and want to give them a lot of credit because I know like we're criticizing Oklahoma City a lot, but we also have to on the other end give Dallas the credit that they deserve for taking this series so far, right? Like
Hundred
this isn't a
percent.
like Dallas is quote unquote cheating or benefiting from the like they're winning, like they're punching OKC in the mouth, and PJ Washington has just been basically the best player on the floor for the most part. That's
Yeah.
kind of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, he's been the best role player, and he's definitely been the biggest X factor that I think a lot of people didn't really see coming potentially, and he's
Yeah, like
arrived.
if Yeah, like if he plays, I mean, nobody's saying he's gonna average 25 a game, but like if he's all of a sudden getting up to like 15, or so, and he's shooting the ball really well and does the other things that he does, on both ends of the floor well, right? Like then that's like that's gonna be a wrap on the series because
Yes,
again,
sir.
like you know, series are won by the stars, right? But there's a lot of games that can be won by the role players, especially like certain moments and stretches where it's like if you have, a guy like a PJ Washington, just for like 1 or 2 games, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like in both games they won, he was great. And that's 2 games that you won where your two stars weren't as incredible as we know they can be. But you had another guy step up, in during important stretches where they needed help. Like, and that all of a sudden then they have 2 more games to win. Those could be the 2 games where Luka and Kyrie just take the game over and dominate. Like, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like that, it just makes your job so much easier when you have, you know, some role players that can do things on both ends. I mean, that's why we like the moves that Dallas made at the deadline. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
we thought they were one of the biggest winners. I mean, of the deadline, especially when you consider in the West, like nobody else really made any significant, trades or moves, right? Like, I mean, you look at the rest of the teams, like Minnesota. What did they do? They traded for Monte Morris. Okay, I mean, he hasn't really done much recently, but
Right.
like I guess he's a better player than the guys that they moved to get him. Denver literally didn't do anything. And then OKC traded for Gordon Hayward, who stinks right now. So I mean, like, so
Yeah.
where you look at Dallas, they got 2 starters. They were able to find 2 guys that now have started and play positions of need for Dallas, right? Where it's like, okay, like we were like, wow, Derek Jones Jr. starting for the Mavs is interesting, but now like in a lineup, where they have like Luca, who is struggling from three, but obviously he is a good 3-point shooter. Obviously Kyrie's a good 3-point shooter. I mean PJ Washington is what 32% or whatever, but in Dallas with a lot more open shots, it's gonna be better. And then Gafford, obviously, around the basket, like then that helps, like then like you're not relying on Derek Jones Jr. to hit as many threes in a game, right? He was like 1 for 10, but it
Hmm.
didn't matter. You had other guys step up, on offense. So
Yeah.
that's cool. So that's the importance of role players, in these type of series. And, again, it's not really rocket science or anything, but we know who the stars are, right? So if the stars are kind of at a draw, then if the role players kind of swing the series, that's what's going to happen. So like you said, series isn't over. But I think if OKC loses this next game, then it's probably done. Like
Sure.
3-1, I guess, yeah, we've seen teams come back from 3-1, but I don't think this team would be the team that would do it.
Agreed.
And then we also had Cavs Celtics, right? Like obviously, okay, it was funny, it was cute, it was cool, that Cleveland was able to, destroy Boston in Boston. And then Boston in this game, much better performance. It was still closer, for stretches. They went out to a 20 something point lead in the third and Cleveland battled back. Um, but it's the same issues that we talked about, where it's like, yeah, Cleveland doesn't have too many issues scoring. At least Donovan Mitchell doesn't. But then like the defensive end is where it becomes a problem because it's like they just don't have anybody that can really slow down Boston's, main guys, mainly their wings,
Yeah.
right? Because like Jalen Brown had 28 and 9 and only missed 4 shots. And Jason Tatum shot 11 for 25, but like, he was good for most of the game. I know in the fourth, I think that was when he started missing, but he was great on the boards, 13 rebounds. Like he was really good in this game.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, he kind of ran out of stuff in the fourth, but it didn't matter. Like he was the main driver, and as well as Drew Holiday, right? He had 18 points. Can't forget to mention him. He had 18 points, 8 rebounds, which is huge, right? Because he, got a couple of extra possessions for Boston. Um, Derek White 3 for 8, right? So he kind of came back to earth offensively. But then you got a big Holiday game, and obviously Tatum and Brown were very good as well. The bench didn't do quite as much, but they didn't need to. I mean,
Yeah.
again, you look at Cleveland, just not much other than Donovan Mitchell, right? He had 33. I think he had like 30 through 3 quarters, basically. But then look around. Isaac Okoro, 2 points. Max Struess, 6 points. Evan Mobley had 17 and 8, which is nice. Garland had 15 and 6, but he went back to the bad version of Garland, where he's
Hmm.
6 for 50. And he competes, I guess, on the defensive end, but he's out there for his offense. Karis LeVert, I guess, was okay, 6 for 12. Dean Wade came back, which I think he had missed the last almost 30 games, but obviously he looked like it was his first game. He was plus 12. Um, and that's kind of where, again, that's where like not having another wing forward really hurts, right? That's why like a guy like a Dean Wade, a lot of Cavs fans have talked about, kind of the importance of having a guy like that because it's just, especially, again, without a Jared Allen, you just don't have enough size on the floor to be able to keep Boston's wings, away from the basket, right? Because that's where they were kind of living, right? Like Tatum got to the free throw line 9 times, right? And that was huge, right? Because there were some possessions where like they guarded him well, but then they fouled because they just don't have the size. Um, Maybe Cleveland gets another game, but also like then you look at the 3-point attempts, 36. They took more threes than Boston. I feel like this Cleveland team, if you're getting into a 3-point shooting contest with Boston, you're probably going to lose. Like, I mean, to be honest, like I guess, like you look at the percentages 33 compared to 38. But like if you're Cleveland, I don't know. Like that like game 2, like they, didn't take that many threes, right? I think they made 13 or whatever. But like just in general, that's not your game. You know what I mean? Like they do have some good three-point shooters, but you're not going to be able to outshoot the Celtics, especially because there's other areas of the floor that the Celtics probably have some other advantages in, especially defensively, right? Because the Cavs would come back and then Boston would get a few key stops, run up the floor, and score, right? Because like again, in terms of their identity, right? Like they play defense at a really high level, right? That's kind of been their identity for years. Obviously now their offense is much improved. Um, but when they're getting out and getting stops, that's when they're at their best because then they can get out and run. And obviously, they're great at moving the ball and spreading the ball around as well, right? This was closer to the Celtics that we expected, to be in this series, right? So I don't know. Does Cleveland win another game? I mean, maybe, but I don't know. It just you need more from guys out that not named Donovan Mitchell, and they just haven't gotten that. Which again, like, is kind of what I expected. But then, like defensively, you're also getting toasted as well. So that's the other factor. But Cleveland is just not in Boston's league as a team, especially again when you're missing Jared Allen. Obviously, Boston doesn't have Porzingis, so that's another factor as well, where it would probably be even more Jover if he was playing.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. So again, for Boston, just don't waste any more games. Get out of this series as healthy as you can and be prepared for the next round, right? Because we know that that other series is going to go at least 6, because it's tied. So if you're Boston, win 2 more games, get out unscathed, and wait for your next opponent. Like, I mean, that's kind of what this is here.
Yeah, and my main takeaway from this game was more so, Cleveland doesn't have enough. They just don't have enough firepower on both ends of the floor. Evan Mobley still very raw on offense, but on defense he didn't really do a whole lot in this game. And Tatum kind of just had his way, getting to the basket, which is something that we like to see from him. Also, Jaylen Brown doing the same thing, and that's what we talked about. The way to bounce back from that horrible loss in Game 2 is just go back to the basics, get to the rack. You don't have to settle for threes. Just get the easy stuff and get going. And that's kind of what they did here. Like you talked about, Drew Holiday having a great game as well. Other guys just need to show up for Cleveland. You can't just be Donovan Mitchell. It's kind of reminiscent of Minnesota, where it's like it's just Donovan Mitchell out there in this game, and nobody else really showed up, and that's kind of the unfortunate part. And I guess you would really want more from Mobley, but I think he even turned his ankle in this game, came back, tried to do what he did, but it just wasn't enough. And even with Jared Allen, I feel like this series would probably have the same result. And in Game 2, we saw the best version of Cleveland, and in this one, you kind of just got the normal version of them. And it's tough. I think you're kind of leaving this series with a lot of questions. And I just don't know what you can really do because I think Boston is leagues and light years ahead of them. Just Boston tends to get complacent and drop games for whatever reason, specifically Game 2s in this postseason. But, I think they're going to come out of this series alive and unscathed.
Yeah, like neither of us were worried or concerned at all.
No.
Like, I mean, like again, this is the point when I make where it's very hard to sweep an NBA basketball team, right?
Yes.
Like, I mean, again, we all thought that the Wolves were going to come in, sweep the Nuggets. Guess what? They won 2 in a row. Again, maybe Cleveland gets one more, but like I said, that's my point, right? Like, this is an NBA team, even though
Mm-hmm.
Cleveland is nowhere near as good as Boston. Like, you just never know, right? In the modern NBA, you could get hot from 3. The other team could stink from 3. And then you win by like 20 or 30. Like, that's kind of what happened in game 2. The main question would be, was there stuff that was sustainable? I mean, like, clearly Donovan Mitchell, like, Cleveland, or excuse me, Boston has a problem with. I mean, some of that is like, the switches, right? Where it's like Al Horford, trying to guard Donovan Mitchell. Like, he just can't stay in front of him, right?
Yeah.
And it would be the same thing if it was Porzingis as well, right? It's just a matter of like closer to the basket. That's where it becomes a problem because he's a lot, longer,
Yeah.
um, than an Al Horford, right?
And Donovan
Horford is
Mitchell's
very,
elite, dude. Like, you have to give him
yeah,
his props. Like, I've seen a lot of Donovan Mitchell hate, but he's giving it all this series. He's their guy. It's just a
yeah.
matter of the roster constructed around him probably isn't the best fit to I ideally kind of win a championship if you're going to build around him.
Because that's the thing. Like, there's going to be other guards where that's going to be a problem for Boston as well, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, a guy that can shoot threes off the dribble, and they get switched and the big gets switched onto them, it's going to be a problem because they're not going to be able to be quick enough, to stay in front of them. It's just, again, Cleveland doesn't have the horses, like you said, on either end of the floor. Because again, like that's kind of the main thing is like we know Mitchell can score, but who else can you really rely on for other consistent sources of offense? Like, okay, Mobley, I guess, cool, right? But clearly not when he's playing next to Jared Allen. Like, does Allen come back? Maybe, but like, does it really matter at this point?
Yeah,
Probably not.
no,
So, we'll see.
it's
But
done. I think the series is a wrap, bro.
right. So, yeah, I mean, again, this is, pretty much what we've been talking about in terms of the second round. Obviously, now, a lot of these series, some of them are over. Some of them are getting pretty interesting, right? At least we do have two series that are for sure going to go at least six, right? Knicks Pacers at least six, Minnesota Denver at least six, and then the other ones are 2-1, right? So I think the Boston Cleveland one is probably over.
Yep.
Dallas OKC feels like it's over and that Dallas is going to win, but that one's not technically over yet. Like, I think there's more hope for OKC
Mm-hmm.
in this series than there is for Cleveland.
Agreed.
Like Knicks Pacers, it's 2-2. It feels like it might be over for New York, but there's still a chance that you could pull it out.
Sure.
And obviously, um, you know, uh, what is the other one or is that it?
Minnesota,
Yeah,
Denver.
Minnesota, Denver. That's a toss up, right? It feels like Denver's taking all the momentum, but they could vomit all over themselves in Game 5 and brick a ton of shots, and then
Sure.
all of a sudden it's bad. But we'll see. So now we go to the draft lottery, which, you know, this is a draft, obviously, that there's not a lot of expectations for. We've talked about it. Like, there are a lot of good players in this draft. It's just there may not necessarily be any superstars. So I know people are comparing it to like the 2013 draft, right? That had Anthony Bennett go number one. Like, I don't think the number one pick is going to be an Anthony Bennett type player.
Mm-hmm.
I do, like I said, I think there's a lot of good players, but obviously we don't know who's going to get picked where. But we do have the lottery to talk about. So some interesting things happen here, right? So obviously here's the order from 14 to 1. Portland, Sacramento, OKC, Chicago at 11, Utah at 10, Memphis 9, San Antonio 8, Portland 7, Charlotte 6, Detroit 5, Spurs 4, Houston 3, your Wizards at 2, and the Atlanta Hawks with a 3% chance to get the number 1 pick. Had the 10th best odds. They move up to 1. So terms of some interesting discussions here, right? So I know Portland, they had 2 picks because they had their own, which was
Mm-hmm.
7.
Mm-hmm.
And the 14 one was Golden State's, because I think that came from that Iguodala trade where it went to Memphis, and then Memphis sent it. I think it was in that Marcus Smart trade or whatever it was, and
Mm-hmm.
then Drew Holiday. So it ended up in Portland. So obviously Golden State wasn't going to keep the pick. I think it was top 4 protected, but it wasn't going to be top 4 unless there was some crazy luck involved,
Right.
like Atlanta. Um, and then obviously not much else changed for the next few picks, right? Like OKC was 12. I believe that was Utah's. No, that was Houston's pick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the Houston pick. And then Chicago was at 11. Utah was at 10. I think they just missed the cutoff because I think if Utah's was like 12, then it would have gone to OKC. Um, Memphis was at 9. Spurs were at 8. And then Portland was 7. Charlotte 6. And I think the other factor was the Spurs won at 8. This is where Toronto, that was a problem because they lost all those games towards the end, right? They wanted to tank because they wanted to avoid being in that 8 to 10 spot because I think their pick was top 6 protected. That was from the Jakob Poeltl trade, and it dropped to 8, and then they lost their pick. So they lost a lot of games, and they're not going to have a pick at all. Instead, it goes to the Spurs, who get the 8th and the 4th pick. So the rich get richer
Mm-hmm.
there. And then obviously we had Detroit, who had the worst record, I think, tied with Washington, basically. They dropped all the way down to 5. Now, this isn't like last year where the difference between 1 and 5 is 1 is Wembanyama, 5 is everyone else. Um, well, yeah, not everyone else because it's not even Brandon Miller or Scoot or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but I still got a sore Thompson. But this is different. So this isn't as backbreaking, but it's obviously brutal that you had the worst record back-to-back years and you dropped to 5 in back-to-back years. But that's also, the flattened lottery odds. That's where this is a huge thing now, where it's like, um, now, I think before the team with the worst record stood alone with a 25% chance of getting the number 1 pick. Now, it's like a 14% chance. So that means there's like an 86% chance that you don't get the number one pick, right? Which
Yeah.
is a very high percentage chance. Um, but Atlanta, right? Pretty wild, right? Which is why like a lot of people talk about like these funny NBA scripts, right? Because we had heard so much about, you know, Trey Young, DeJounte Murray. What did the Hawks do? And now they might have some, more answers, that they've been able to figure out. Because with the number one pick, you have a lot of different options. You can either use the number one pick, take whoever you want is that's available. Um, you could trade the number one pick to bring in somebody. I don't think I would do that if I'm Atlanta, but you could. Or you could say, all right, let's trade one of the Atlanta guards. And like maybe we don't have to get back quite as much crazy stuff because we just got a number one pick that we could possibly, build around or
Hmm.
whatever. And then kind of go from there. So there's a lot of, opportunities for Atlanta here. I don't know what direction they take. I believe Woj kind of put out the idea that there's a real possibility that they could trade Trey Young, right? So that makes me think that like, okay, this might be coming, or like they might be okay with like just rebuilding and being like, we got the number one pick, whoever it is, we'll take, and then we'll just kind of get back whatever we get back for Trey Young, whether it's picks or players or whatever, and then go from there. So obviously, there's some key winners and losers here, right? Like Atlanta's a big winner, Spurs are a big winner. I guess Houston went up to 3, so that's kind of that's a huge win for them because they're another team where they can either take a player or trade the pick. I guess for Washington, it's nice that you didn't drop all the way down like Detroit. You
Hmm.
dropped to 2, I guess like 1 or 2. Yeah, it's like that's fine.
Yeah.
And then obviously Toronto's a very big loser in this scenario, but kind of go through your thoughts on the lottery because watching it in person was kind of funny. I mean, not in person like I was there, but
Yeah.
like just watching
Live. Yeah.
live was kind of interesting. But kind of take me through your thoughts on this lottery thing and kind of what you think the next move for some of these teams should be.
Yeah, and it's like the beautiful thing about the lottery, I feel like, is especially with a draft like this where there's no clear cut number one. Now we can kind of piece together what the order of the draft is going to potentially be, and Atlanta getting number one is kind of crazy. Just to think about how the stars are about to align, it kind of has trade written all over it. In terms of they're going to probably move on from somebody, but if they decide to like really use this number one pick, it would be intriguing if they really do go for a big man. Like I think Sar is probably like the guy with the most potential, and probably that's probably going to be the number one pick. And because I think they have Clint Capella entering the final year of his deal, so I think there is a pathway for him to potentially get to Atlanta. It all just depends on if they want to keep the pick or not, which is cool. And I think that's going to probably set the tone for the rest of the draft because I think there's a lot of potential for a lot of these teams to kind of improve in areas where they're potentially lacking. Like I don't look at Detroit as that bad of a loser in this situation because I think there's probably going to be a raw prospect available for them at number 5. Like they could pick like a guy like Mataz, where it's like, okay,
Yeah,
now you've got a wing. It's like, okay, that might be somewhere that you could be lacking in terms of your depth, and he's young, so that's going to help, although he's more of like a project guy. But then even like a team like, let's say, the Spurs, them having those 2 picks is amazing. They could really double down and kind of fix their guard room in one draft. Like, I don't know if he's going to be available. They could pick Rob Dillingham at number 8. And then at number 4, my least favorite guy, Nikola Topic. There's your guard room. Those 2 guys kind of offset each other. I'm trying to think of who else. I think, what is it, Memphis? They have number 9. They could pick a guy who could potentially fall, like Ron Holland. I think there's a
right.
lot of potential for these teams to kind of fill some holes that they really have. I am curious, though, if any of these lottery picks are going to get moved in terms of traded
Yeah,
in going into the offseason, and heading up towards the draft. That's what I'm curious about because I think people are kind of undervaluing these picks just because there's a lot of established role players in this draft that I think a lot of contenders could potentially use.
yeah, and that's why, like to me, like a team like Toronto is a way bigger loser than Detroit. Because, like,
100%.
yeah, if you're Detroit, it sucks that you had the worst record and dropped to 5, but at least you have a pick. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you had something, right? And this is not a draft where it's the worst thing in the world to not have the number one pick. Like, obviously, you want the top pick because then you can, in theory, take the best guy. But again, like we said, there's a lot of options here because you can either, I don't think Detroit would do this, right? But like, you could either, take that pick, you could trade down, you could trade the pick entirely, to just bring in like, more of a ready contributor. And like I said, I wouldn't do that if I'm Detroit, but like just in general, there's a lot of flexibility there, right? So like for Toronto, it's rough out there. I mean, I guess like for Toronto, like maybe you can say we have Scotty Barnes,
Hmm.
so like we already have a quote unquote guy, so maybe we could have taken a guy that could just help, but now you don't have that option at all. And that's kind of rough. Where like all that because you traded for Jakob Pertl, like was it really worth it?
Right.
Like I guess that would kind of be like the biggest question I would have here, which is kind of why like what they did last year's deadline just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Like I mean, of all the teams that I would have expected to be a buyer, it wouldn't have been the Raptors, right? Because like they ended up just being in the play-in, and then they lost, and then this year, they were okay after the deadline, and then they got hurt. But I don't know. Maybe like maybe they come back and they're healthy, and then they make me look foolish again. And well, not again because I didn't think they were going to be good this year. But
Right.
either way, like maybe like Barnes takes another step forward. And then the other guys like get like a whole off season to work together. But like I don't know. Like I mean, are they gonna be in the mix of these playoff teams in the East? I don't know. Like it just maybe there's a team that falls, but like, of the 8 teams that were in the East in the playoffs, like which one is the one that is most likely to fall? Because like Boston's not going anywhere.
Right.
The Knicks, I don't think are going anywhere. Indiana's not going anywhere. Like Milwaukee should still be a quality team. Same with Philly. So outside of that, I mean, like, Cleveland, maybe if they move Mitchell, maybe they take a step back or something. I
Right.
like maybe, but like I don't know. Like, are they gonna be that bad? Like I feel like they still have other talent on the roster where it's like maybe if you get some stuff back for Mitchell, but then it's like you don't have a top, 20 guy. So you're probably gonna be worse anyway. So I don't know. That's like is Toronto gonna be as good as any of those teams just based off of like the growth of their individual players? I just feel like that's kind of a stretch. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
100%.
that's kind of yeah. So we'll see, but yeah, like the Hawks thing again. That's kind of why like a lot of people feel like the draft lottery is kind of like not like rigged, but like well, kind of, but you know what I mean?
Scripted as heck, man.
Yeah, because it's just like wow. Like of all the teams that like would have gotten the number one pick, it's kind of like what was it? It was like New Orleans, AD leaves, and on the way out they get the number one pick and they get
Yeah.
Zion.
And it was a
Like or the
6% chance or something crazy like
yeah,
that.
yeah, or like the Spurs get the number one pick and they get to take Wemby after having David Robinson and Tim. And I'm not saying it's rigged, but like you know what I mean. Like
Sure.
just some of these outcomes just feel just so funny. But like also like going in, like I don't think either of us expected the Hawks to get a top 3 pick. So the fact that they did, good on them because it
Yeah.
opens the like this makes it a lot easier, I think, to kind of decide what you might want to do because at least now you can say, okay, we let's say we trade Trey Young, definitely going to be a worse team,
Hmm.
but now we can start over. Because I think the issue for the Hawks is that it's clear that what you have isn't working and isn't good enough. So they didn't want to spend a ton of money when they were like a half decent team. So like, now why would you want to spend a ton of money on a roster that clearly is just not that good? You're better off kind of just breaking it up, you know,
Right.
figuring out where to go from there. Maybe you just trade DeJounte Murray and just be like, let's get something back for him. Maybe more teams would want him versus a Trey Young, maybe because of his contract or whatever. And then like Trey Young, number one pick, some other guys, maybe, or you trade Trey Young. I don't know what they're gonna do because the Hawks have done a lot of very random, unexpected things where it's like you don't trade John Collins for years when his value's high, then you trade it when it's at its absolute lowest and get nothing back, literally nothing,
Yeah.
right? Like you trade Kevin Herter when his value was low, you got nothing back basically. Like I
Yeah.
mean, you just freed up money. Like for who? Nobody. So
Exactly.
yeah, like the Hawks, I don't know. They've made a lot of really weird moves. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do something that literally nobody expects. Could be wrong, but I don't know. Like I guess it's kind of cool that the Hawks have the number one pick, but like how cool is it? I don't know.
I mean, I think it's good for basketball. It's always good when a team that's not the best gets the number one pick. I would have been furious if, I don't know, OKC got the number one pick. It's like, all right, now we're just doing too much. But talking about OKC, I think it is interesting that they have the 12th pick. And that is an easy pick where you can just pick probably like the best shooter in the draft and fix your potential shooting woes if you get eliminated because of that.
Or get another big.
That too. Like, you could do a lot, and maybe you could get both, because I think there's a guy, Tyler Smith, in the draft actually, and I think his value would probably be predicted around like that 12th pick, where he could shoot and he's a power forward and he's 6'11". I think that beats what was the other guy's name? The guy they traded at the deadline. I think it was what is it?
Alexis Pokashevsky.
Yeah, like I think that Tyler Smith is probably a better player than him, if you want me to be real. So that kind of replaces that shooting.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, again, maybe he found a home in Charlotte, but it didn't work in OKC.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's kind of the thing there. And again, they could also, if they really wanted to, trade the pick. Because there's going to be a certain point where you can't keep every single young player. Because that's how they kind of got into a spot where, like, hey, there's some guys that were decent players that were on the roster that are just, they had to cut. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So something that you have to factor in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember their names right now, but you know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
So, I mean, again, yeah, the draft lottery is always fun, even like you said, when it's not like considered a draft that has like a lot of star power, because there's always the possibility that there could be stuff. And again, we didn't see a lot of trades in last year's draft. I know there were some trades that were done before, right? Like the Porzingis one was done before. I'm pretty sure like the Chris Paul, Bradley Beal one was kind of like wrapped up before the draft. Like maybe not the Jordan Poole aspect of it, but there were some big trades that were done before. But on draft day, there really wasn't a lot.
Right.
So maybe we might see more now that all the picks are kind of, pretty much, well, not kind of, they are wrapped up at this point, because that's always, because again, like, it's going to be interesting because for some teams, the draft might be the only way to realistically improve, especially if you don't have a lot of cap. Like say for, a team like the Nuggets who don't have cap space, like, that's why they took, they had like 3 first-round picks or whatever last year because they were hoping that one of them would be playable. Now, to be honest, none of them have really been playable this postseason so far, but maybe next year or down the road, they might be.
Right.
So, I mean, and that's the tough part, right? Whereas, say, like for Golden State, like, congrats, like you got a guy in Brandon Pajemski and a guy in Trace Jackson Davis who helped you a lot, right? Didn't do much in that play-in game, but obviously they can grow from that. So, that's kind of where you look at the draft could potentially be very helpful for certain teams, regardless of whether or not they have a lottery pick or not.
Yeah, and we're probably going to talk about this, around June, or whenever the finals are over and the off season really starts. Then we can kind of start, doing mock drafts and breaking all this stuff down, because I think it is going to be a very interesting, polarizing draft class. But I think there are a lot more positives than people are kind of making it out to seem.
Especially because we're also seeing, other rumors going around, like say, the teams like Philly and New York might move their picks, right? Like they might move their first round picks, to bring in, some, veteran guys, on cheap contracts or whatever, as opposed to drafting somebody who may take a little bit of time, to get ready, right? Like if there's going to be other teams that may approach that as well, because again, like there's a lot of teams that have picks. We saw some teams move their picks at the deadline, right? Like we saw a couple of teams move their 2024 firsts because they, or, someone else's 2024 first because they're like, this draft, like we'd rather have this guy.
Right.
Like I think the Pacers moved one of their 2024 first. I think it was a different team's. It wasn't their own. Because they're like, yeah, we'd rather have Pascal Siakam than whoever we could draft, which makes a lot of sense. I mean,
yes, sir.
They wouldn't be in the position they're in, without, Siakam, even though he's had some weird games, but he's also had a lot of good games that have helped get them to where they are at this point.
Yes, sir.
And then, also say for like, according to Mark Stein, like New Orleans, they're thinking about possibly moving on from Ingram, right? Like, we know, I think he has a year left on his deal. There's kind of been talks that they probably don't really want to extend him. I know you mentioned when they got eliminated, right? The GM, David Griffin, was talking about like, yeah, we've kind of seen enough from this group to know that we're probably going to have to, do some stuff, right? Like he kind of said the quiet part out loud where it's like, yeah, we're probably going to make some big changes to this team. And there's going to be a lot of teams that I think would be interested in a guy like a Brandon Ingram, right? Like maybe a team like a Cleveland, or maybe, some other team like, Detroit, or like, some team that doesn't have, like a really solid, wing player, right? There's going to be teams that would be interested in a guy like that, right? Like, because he's not a bad player. Like, it's the fit between him and Zion is very clunky. Clearly, he's not good enough to be a number one, but he could probably be like, a two or a three, elsewhere, right? Just not in New Orleans.
Right. Yeah. I
Yeah,
agree with that. Like
right.
100%.
Exactly. Yeah, because he just doesn't fit, I think
Yeah.
what they're trying to do with Zion, right? Like you can see like they're thinking about, let's pay Trey Murphy third a bunch of money, right? And it's like, yeah, like, is he a max player? Not necessarily, but he's still really good.
Yeah.
And also, you don't want to lose him, especially because he's a great fit, next to a guy like a Zion, right?
Yeah.
Because like, he can do a lot of the outside perimeter shooting stuff at a high volume as well, right? Like Herb Jones has improved as a 3-point shooter. So that's where, like, if you're in New Orleans, like, we know now Zion's the guy. Like, I mean, probably should have already known that, but early in the year, it didn't feel like that. It felt like it might be Brandon Ingram's team, but now we know, like, with the way Zion played during the latter part of the season, it's his team. The,
Yeah.
the issue, obviously, for him is his health,
Hmm.
so that's obviously a big problem, going forward. But at the same time, I don't know, but like, or
Yeah.
maybe even a team like Philly could be like, let's trade for Brandon Ingram. Like, they're not going to take anything back, right? So like, they're going to probably just use the cap space. So if I'm New Orleans, I would probably like to get something back,
Right.
right? If it even if it's not a star, maybe like other helpful role player pieces, right? Because it may not be a star for star swap. Um, so I don't know, but either way, like, I think that this makes a lot of sense because if you're New Orleans, like, you're at a point now where you probably have to start thinking about how can we get this team to the next level.
Yeah, because I think there is a pathway to do it. And locking up the young talent early is always a good deal because people were scratching their heads when Michael Porter Jr. got like a crazy contract, but it's like, what the heck? And look at him now. He helped them win a title, and he's helping them potentially win another one. I
Yeah,
think another one that people were scratching their heads about was Devin Vassell. I think that contract will age like fine wine once he kind of develops alongside Wemby and the young core that they're building over there. So you do need to lock up your young talent for long term because I think those guys are going to be essential in terms of like Trey Murphy and stuff. And you need to move on, not necessarily from like dead weight because I don't think Brandon Ingram's dead weight. I just think he's more so not a great fit alongside Zion.
exactly. Like, no, like, nobody should treat him like he's garbage. Like,
Yeah,
he's
he's a
not that
really
at
good
all.
player, just not
Yeah,
a good fit.
he's just not a good fit next to Zion. And if you're gonna have a really expensive roster, you got to have guys that make a lot of sense that fit next to Zion because you can only have but so much salary on your roster, and it just you may not be helpful in that regard.
Yes, sir.
And then, we already talked about, Budenholzer, right? It sounds like, now he's got the 5-year deal, or, $50+ million deal. So we've already kind of touched on that. Obviously there's some other teams, right, that are in, a position looking for new coaches, right? And one of those teams is the Lakers, right? So there's been a number of names that have been tossed around, since the last time we kind of discussed it, right? Like, there's been names like James Borrego, right? Kenny Atkinson, right? Micah Nori, obviously also Reddick. Again, are you interested in any of those names? If you
Mm.
are, the Lakers, because again, like, in theory, any of them could work out really well, but also in theory, any of them could also go very poorly, right? Like, I guess Atkinson has the most head coaching experience, but it's been a while since he's been a head coach. And his exit in Brooklyn, I think there was a little bit of tension between him and the Stars. So obviously, if he goes to LA, right, he'd be, coaching some other stars. Borrego, right, he improved every year in Charlotte, but is he a guy that you would want, being a head coach for a quote unquote contending team? Like, maybe, but I don't know. Mike Nori, right, he's in Minnesota, right? And I guess he's kind of the lead guy taking over while Chris Finch, is hampered with his injury. Like, I'm sure Chris Finch is helping, right? But obviously Nori's got the lead right now. Um, but what is he going to do as a head coach? I don't know. He might do a lot, but maybe not. And then I think there was also, what was it, David Adelman, right? Who's an assistant for the Nuggets. And then you have Reddick, right? Who, again, That's another guy where he'd be a first-time head coach like some of these other guys, but he has no head coaching experience. So that would be the one that I feel like I would be like, I don't know, kind of the most, not super happy about. And it's nothing to do with him. It's just more so like, I just don't necessarily know how much I could buy that like a guy that has no head coaching experience can come in and all of a sudden coach a championship team. I think Steve Kerr, I guess that happened to him, right? Because I know he had front office experience, but I don't think he had any head coaching experience before he coached Golden State, and obviously they won the title there. It's a different mix this time around, right? Because this is an older core, as opposed to him coming into a young up and coming core. But I don't know, like like again, I don't know everything about all of these coaches, but obviously these are names that are coming up, and we know at a certain point they're going to have to make a decision because obviously you would like to have a coach, probably before the draft, and then certainly before free agency, so you can help put together ideally a roster that makes sense given who is coaching the team.
I mean, yeah, I think the Lakers, they need to probably take their time with this one. Um, and the interesting thing about JJ Redick is like sometimes these guys who are praised for like their high IQ in the media and all this stuff, maybe they're not best suited for coaching. But I think the main selling point is for sure, how knowledgeable he is in the game of basketball, alongside the fact that he clearly has a very good relationship with LeBron James. So I think
Yeah.
that's another selling point. But another thing that's kind of intriguing is the Lakers are not the only people kind of interested in JJ Redick. Like he has a lot of suitors. Like I think um, it was Toronto last offseason. That's when we kind of initially heard
Yeah.
the first rumblings of him
Charlotte.
trying to dabble in.
Charlotte.
Yeah, and then
Charlotte.
Charlotte was that one, and then
Yeah.
there are some suitors, but it's going to be a tough hire because I think you do have to take into account a lot of factors. You know, like
Yeah.
how many years is LeBron going to be there? What is the future going to look like? What's the direction of the team? Um, and I don't know. I'm very curious to see where this goes, but I don't want them to rush anything or feel any pressure from other teams where it's like the Suns kind of got their guy, and then the Hornets got their guy as well. So I don't know. We'll see, but I just don't want them to rush into anything and just be stupid about it.
Yeah, because the worst thing you could do is rush into it and pick a guy,
Yeah.
um, and then you know, and then they end up not being what you expect. But again, like I would also hope that like just the approach in general, like in terms of not just the coach, but also like the roster building, because I mean, again, we've seen what works next to LeBron and AD, and I just think a roster with mainly offensive players next to them, like while that's nice, it probably isn't quite enough to be able to win multiple rounds in the playoffs.
And what kind of
Um, you
style would JJ Redick's coaching
Right.
be? Like, I'm
And
pretty sure he would be geared towards offense. Just saying.
yeah, but it's
But it
that's the
is
thing.
interesting.
Yeah, but that's the thing. We don't know because he hasn't been a head coach before. So we don't really know, like what his style of coaching, would really be. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the factor where like, okay, maybe that works in his favor, but then it could also work against him because, obviously like then if it doesn't work, everybody's gonna be like, well, why did you hire a guy that has no coaching experience anyways?
He could be
But then
like
like
Steve Kerr, or it could be like Steve Nash. Either one of the two.
yeah, exactly, because that was the other example, like you mentioned, good point, where it didn't work, right? Like, in like the first year, it seemed fine.
Hmm.
Obviously you had some crazy stuff like the Kevin Durant shoe moment or whatever that was. But then obviously the next season it went pretty poorly,
Yeah.
right? Like, like I just remember like the last game where like I think like he would just like literally like just went insane. Like, like in the unhinged mode, right? Where you picked up a tech and you knew like there that's like, yeah, he's probably done. Um,
Yeah, he started seeing red.
yeah, and again, like not all his fault. Jacques Vaughn came in and I guess quote unquote patched it up, but not really, right? Because
Yeah.
then they ended up trading Durant and Kyrie
Yeah.
and didn't win a playoff game, and then they were one of the worst teams in the NBA this year, and now he's gone.
Yep.
So, now I guess what was it, Jordy Fernandez? Now he's ushering in the next era of Brooklyn Nets basketball,
Hmm.
without a draft pick, which is unfortunate, but still, yeah, I don't know. But like you said, they do need to take their time. And I would hope that they would, kind of again, like take a very detailed approach, to what they're doing, right? Like, again, making sure like who's responsible for what, right? Because like sometimes that can kind of be a factor as well, right? Where it's like, okay, Mike Inori's the lead assistant for Minnesota. What does he actually do? You know what I mean? Like, what is his actual role? What is his input? Same thing with all these other assistants, right? Like Atkinson. What does he do for Golden State? Is he offense? Is he defense? Is he both?
You're
Is
right.
he player development? Same thing with all the other stuff, right? And I don't have access to that information, right? I don't work for the Lakers.
You're right.
But that's their job to figure out, right? So ideally, right, like they, do all their research, figure out who it is, and then go from there. And then, the, whatever happens next, right? Because because obviously, like when Ham was hired, I think there were a lot of Laker fans that were pretty pleased, with the hiring, right? Because I think a lot of people, kind of thought that like of the people that were available, he was probably the best one, right? And then they were calling for his heads, like like a
You're
couple
right.
months in, because he was playing 3 guard lineups, and he had a fine first year, but then like this year, right? We saw at the end of that game 3 against the Nuggets, where you had the fire Darvin chance, and even before the game, right, he was getting booed. So that's the other part where there's a lot. Whoever is the head coach, there's going to be a lot of pressure as well, right? Because obviously, if it doesn't work out early, they're not going to get fired, right? They're not going to get fired 4 games in unless you're Mike Brown. Although he wasn't, that wasn't his first year there. But obviously, if it doesn't work, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny, right? Whereas like nobody's going to care if a team like Charlotte struggles through its first 10, 15 games because they're in a different stage,
Yeah.
than like the Lakers, right?
And they're
So,
also it's two different markets too. Like the Lakers, like you got all the lights on you. That's different. That's a high pressure environment. Charlotte, you got nothing to lose right now.
spotlights over streetlights.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that pretty much, is it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, keep in mind when these series end, we will have live streams, right, covering those games, because we know some of these series within the next week probably going to wrap up, right? Because we're about halfway through most of these series for the most part. So keep that in mind, and obviously, continue to check out our socials, right, where we post shorts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So hopefully we will either see you in the next live stream or we'll see you in the next episode on Friday.